Hello, this is Adam Carroll from Justice for All, and this show is called UN This Week. Today we will be speaking about strongman politics and uh, human rights in Philippines. And maybe a lot of viewers are not knowledgeable about Philippines. It's an excellent time to learn a bit from the war on drugs that promoted extrajudicial, excuse me, let me start again. From a war on drugs that promoted extrajudicial killing to the recent passage of a harsh anti-terrorism act, human rights are under attack in the Philippines, a diverse Asian nation with an interesting historical relationship with the US. To try to understand these challenges and their relevance to the international movement of human rights defenders, we have with us today Drew Elizarde-Miller, the national coordinator of the U.S. chapter of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, a network of over 20 organizations nationwide who are part of a global coalition campaigning for a just and lasting peace in the Philippines. Partners The organization partners with organizations in Philippines representing the most oppressed of the Philippine society, including farmers, workers, women, indigenous people, and land defenders. So welcome to the show, Drew.
Hi, Adam. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, and I understand also that you are joining us from Portland. And we hope, given all the drama around the protests in Portland and the police presence and the troubling implications for the US Constitution, all of that, we hope that maybe a little bit later in the conversation, we can make some connections and reflect. But you deal with similar issues in the Philippines as in this role. And many viewers may not know much about the Philippines, especially in its relationship to the United States. And I was wondering if you maybe could give some background.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Philippines, in terms of its relationship with the United States, we can see in the context of a larger history of colonization in the country. The Philippines was originally colonized by the Spanish as early as the 15 and 1600s. And they were the major colonial force at the time. And for many years. And so that's why you see a very strong and still strong Catholic influence in the Philippines. And even then, under Spanish colonization, it was actually the church and the Catholic Church who were pivotal in the process of subduing to their best efforts the Filipino people, which at the same time does not diminish the resistance that was going on in the country against colonization. So that's the backset in which the U.S. entered the picture. During the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. Was emerging as a greater world power. And so from that time, when the U.S. Really defeated the Spanish and emerged as a stronger world power, the U.S. also took a strong hold on the Philippines. And so there was a period of time in which the U.S. was directly occupying the Philippines, until later on in the mid 20th century, when the Philippines was declared quote unquote independent from the United States. The issue with the independence of the Philippines, however, is that while there was the legally recognized independence from the United States, we also see that the U.S. has maintained both strong economic and military ties and influence on the Philippines since that time, remaining up until today, which we can see highlighted even now by a very close relationship between President Trump in the U.S. and President Duterte in the Philippines, which many have aligned as having a sort of romance between each other in terms of their style of leadership.
I think Philippines first came to my attention when I was younger and I heard about one of your presidents who had a lot of shoes.
Oh yeah, so you're in that case, I'm sure you're referring to Ferdinand Marcos, and his wife Imelda
Imelda,
Marcos.
yes.
Imelda, yeah,
So
uh,
there's been this sense that there's a kind of oligarchy or elite class with special connections to the U.S.
mhm,
For a long time.
mhm,
Um, I just wonder, though, in the many political changes that have taken
mhm,
place since then, reform movements perhaps,
mhm,
um, how would you describe the current political moment with President
mhm,
Duterte?
mhm. Well, it's interesting that you brought up Ferdinand Marcos. Many may know Marcos is pretty renowned as being a dictator, and even relating to the issue that you brought up with the shoes. Imelda Marcos was famous for having hundreds and thousands of shoes, which was really is more of a reflection of the Marcos's wealth and fits that oligarchy standard that you raised. In terms of the current political moment in the Philippines, what's interesting about that is that Duterte himself is very much an open admirer of the Marcos family, and then also has even campaigned alongside of Marcos's son,
Hmm.
and so we see a close connection there. The specific example is some may not know that Marcos was never buried in the Philippines. Um, his body was kept embalmed and frozen. Um, but it was under Duterte and under the president's direction that there was a push to actually bury Ferdinand Marcos, someone who's really uh, uh, hated by many Filipino people because of his crimes. He was buried in what's called the Heroes um, burial site in the Philippines, and so that was amongst people they mark as these are heroes of the Philippine nation, and it was Duterte who actually pushed for Marcos to be buried there, and then that was really foreshadowing of what Duterte's regime would develop into, and really similar to Marcos, in that Duterte has implemented and sought to implement it nationwide martial law. And that was a major mark of the Marcos regime, where there was really a military dictatorship for many years in which the people feared. And it was difficult for free speech to even go outside. There was many disappeared. And Duterte himself has implemented a similar martial law in the Mindanao region for the first several years of his regime, and has made many threats to implement it on a nationwide scale, especially even under COVID, was part of the basis he used to threaten to implement martial law in the country.
Hmm.
And then with the other policies that have come up, you could even say that Duterte has, while not formally declaring martial law over the whole country, has actually done it in practice through the the strong intervention of his military and police across the country.
Hmm. This past Tuesday we had a conversation with Janice Vacadaza from Bolivia, who's an activist who's been uh, struggling with a left uh, leaning but corrupt
Mm,
government that has been in league with certain business interests and
mhm,
been destroying the environment in certain areas really on a mass scale. And so now now in Philippines, it sounds to me like you're describing a right wing movement, but
mhm.
also perhaps would you call fascist?
Yes, absolutely. In terms of the question of fascism, um, historically, what we see with fascism is at a time when there is increasing economic crisis um, among people, but also when even when there's an economic boom, for example, but it can tend towards a period when there's maybe moving forward towards more of a bust. Um, that those at the top or who benefit most from it, in order to sustain a boom for the richest, will move towards state violence um, against the poor, working class people in the United States, people of color. And so it's very clear we see that, and there's a lot of different marks of it. The most obvious is the issue of violence against the people. You mentioned at the beginning Duterte's infamous drug war, which has taken at least 30,000 lives, and that's really when there was like the count stopped, and so it could be even more than that from official reports from the government. And then with that, it's not only the war on drugs, which by itself is atrocious, but it's the specific targeting of human rights defenders and activists. Global Witness just came out with a report, which last year they had deemed the Philippines the most dangerous country to be a land or environmental defender. And it just confirms again that under Duterte, that has continued for another year. Where there's constantly news about activists being killed, and not only activists, but relief workers as well. So there was one person, Joy Porquia, who is with a organization called Bayan Muna, which has some dissent against the Duterte administration because they're advocating for basic issues of the people that he has neglected. And they have criticized his decisions. And yet Joy Porquia was just doing relief work and he was targeted and killed. And there's many others who have been arrested doing relief work as well, even during this COVID-19 pandemic. And so the state violence and killings are one of the most obvious. The repression of the freedom of speech. And then in the news, a major issue has been also the repression of media. So within the past year, and again, this is just under COVID. And so we can also see Duterte's administration exploiting COVID for their growing power and fascism. But the piece I was mentioning is one, the shutdown of ABS-CBN. And that's actually the largest news network in the Philippines. And the Philippine government shut it down. And they're still operating in some circles independently or online. But again, the official shutdown and cutoff of their contracts are over now from the Philippine Congress. And then additionally, one of the most famous cases is of Maria Ressa. And she was a Time Person of the Year, who's the CEO of Rappler, who has also posted articles that are that really just expose the truth about Duterte's crimes, and that is perceived as a threat. And she was just found guilty by a Philippine court of cyber libel. And so, in terms of the question of fascism, again, there is economic crisis in the Philippines where people are poor and hungry. But at the top of the system, there are those who have land and want to remain power and are employing violence to keep in that place.
Yeah, I realize the term fascism isn't always helpful. It doesn't always add to the conversation, but it does sometimes suggest the role of oligarchs and alliances with big business and so forth, as well as the military. And we see a lot of that. You mentioned Mindanao, and I did want to reflect on the diversity of the population. There must be indigenous populations there, and also there's a significant Muslim minority.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could speak to that and how they have
Mm-hmm.
been faring, especially in recent
Mm-hmm.
years.
Yeah. Well, again, in terms of the question of military violence that we were discussing, Mindanao has had under the Duterte administration the highest concentration of the armed forces of the Philippines. And this is in light of civil war happening in the Philippines. It is true that there's a civil war in the country, and that because of the economic and dire social conditions, an issue of land, there are those who are choosing to rebel against the Philippine government. At the same time, the government, the Philippine government's response is not actually to try to address the root problems that our people are struggling with that cause them to take up arms, but rather increase militarization. And that happens in Mindanao in particular. But with that comes something that's been practiced for many years. It's actually included in the UN Human Rights Report that there's a practice of like terror tagging activists or even non-activists and just community members, where civilians become the target of the armed forces of the Philippines. And we can see that even happening a lot during COVID-19. So even at the beginning of the lockdown in the Philippines after COVID was initiated, um, there was a ceasefire declared between the New People's Army and National Democratic Front of the Philippines. And that was actually praised by the UN. It was done upon request and encouragement of the United Nations, and the Philippine government agreed to it as well. The issue is that since this time, even within hours of the time the ceasefire was declared, there were aerial bombings in Mindanao. And so there's been multiple bombings in the region, and they're framed as targeted against, again, the New People's Army or National Democratic Front, or also against Moro and Muslim groups who are pushing for self-determination in their area. But under that guise, what it actually does is it displaces civilians. And so we've seen that where helicopters are used to bomb indigenous communities multiple times in March this year and May. And then it displaced them. And then we also see that being targeted in the Muslim communities as well. There was one incident where there were two girls who were killed due to a mortar shelling coming by from a military camp. And there's many who suffered wounds from the mortar bombs. And it was actually their mother and younger brother who were among 14 relatives that were wounded and also rushed to a regional hospital. And that's just one case amongst the aerial bombings in the Moro community. And then even this past July 15th, there was another indigenous community that was bombed even while children were asleep. And they had to evacuate. 37 families had to evacuate at 1 a.m. in the morning due to this. And so we see that concentrating a lot in the Mindanao region specifically. And it is coupled with, again, this practice of terror tagging, or it's also called red tagging, where they actually will let leaflets fall from helicopters, and it will have like a person's name in the community or an activist, and it says like this person is a communist or they're with the New People's Army. And so we see on the one hand people, again, activists calling for human rights being red tagged or terror tagged, and then their communities and civilians being the most affected.
That's a very sinister tactic. I wonder about who is providing the arms to the Filipino military. Is it the United States?
Mm. Yeah, so that's also one of the most disturbing things. As my organization, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, we have a campaign calling for the end of U.S. support of the Duterte administration, and much of that looks like in the forms of military aid as well as arms sales. So I mentioned these aerial bombings. So while these were happening in March, in April, and then May, and now July, and even before that, there was actually a new arms deal being crafted with the United States. So for many years, the United States has had supplies, and there was even this arms sale that was coming up this year, and it was initiated in April. So that's when there was a notification that was made public of an arms sale to the Philippines that went to Congress. Um, and what the notification gave is that there's two options for the Philippines. So one was either a $450 million arms deal or a $1.5 billion arms deal. And the main components of each of the arms sale were helicopters, and then heavy artillery, bombs, and then again, a lot of weapons that are used in intense and heavy warfare. And so at the same time, there's this increase during COVID-19 of like these aerial bombings in indigenous rural communities that are affected. We also saw the United States agreed to and crafted an arms sale that the U.S. State Department approved in April. And so I want to use that as an example of just showing that despite the major human rights violations in the Philippines, despite these clear tactics of Duterte that repress free speech and the media, the United States has continually been supportive vis-a-vis arms and military aid. And that's something we haven't seen cease.
Well, I guess we supply the helicopters, but we make Philippine government supply and Xerox their own flyers for red tagging. I guess that's fair. But with this really troubling support for the repressive government, does the U.S. government mention China as a reason, sort of geopolitical excuse for supplying this level of support to Duterte?
Absolutely, it's definitely a common argument that we need to maintain our military presence and aid to Duterte because of the issue of China. The hypocrisy of it, especially if you look at this arms sale, is the weapons that are going to the Philippines are not weapons that you use at sea or around the areas of the West Philippine Sea where there's the conflict between the Philippines and China and the US and China. Those weapons are actually for counterinsurgency. And so even going back to another time, when the aerial bombings were first being tested in Mindanao and specifically on Muslim communities, was in the issue of the city of Marawi, where there was a supposed ISIS threat, and there was actually like direct U.S. support, intelligence support. It was the it was the time that the U.S. started a new operation in the Philippines called Operation Pacific Eagle. And so going back to that timeline, it was framed in the language of anti-terror. But we can really see again like a direct U.S. link to the aerial bombings that are happening, because all of that city was bombed. And so while there's this narrative around China, what we see is the areas that the U.S. brings up of most concern in practice or like in the actual arms it's giving is actually happening predominantly in the Mindanao region.
Well, if you want to win hearts and minds, nothing like bombing civilians to do it. We're going to take a station break for a moment. This is Adam Carroll with Justice for All, and we'll be right back. Okay, we're back. Show on the Philippines, strongman politics, or fascism, as one might call it. Duterte is one of President Trump's favorite leaders, and I think that we've described an ongoing high level of support for the brutal military in the Philippines. So, next part of the show, we're going to ask you about your organization and what you've been doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if we could visit you have a couple of websites here for us. And the first one, maybe we can jump on it. Whichever one, we could take a look at the actual image of the website. Maybe here we are. Okay, this is the wrong one, but or is it the right one? Let's see. The work you've been doing. Well, when was the organization founded?
Yeah, so the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, I'll just note, so we're part of a global coalition that's all over the world, and which was founded in 2013 in the Philippines upon the initiative of Filipino human rights defenders and also solidarity organizations around the world. Now, in the case of ICHRP US, so we're a chapter of ICHRP Global, we were founded December of 2017, which was actually a time when the war on drugs was really heightening in the Philippines, and Duterte was becoming known worldwide for his infamous war on drugs.
Yeah. So if you'd like to guide us to any of the sections of this particular website.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, if you just like scroll down a little bit, then you can see some of our latest statements on the issues in the Philippines. So yeah, you can see our positions on the anti-terror law. There's also, if you scroll up, there's a link to join ICHRP. So if you are learning about the situation in the Philippines and educated and want to do something about it, then you can also go to the Who Are We section. And then there's a link to join ICHRP and submit an application, whether as a member, as an organization, or as an individual member. And then
Well,
I can...
Go ahead, please.
I'm also happy to share more about some of our campaign materials, which are best on the humanrightsph.org website.
Okay, so the other website now.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we're going to visit that one.
And then in terms of the other website that I know is being scrolled to right now, humanrightsph.org. So one of our main campaigns this year is a campaign for the Philippine Human Rights Act. So the Philippine Human Rights Act is language we designed really based off the progress of the Berta Cáceres bill from highlighting issues of U.S. security assistance to Honduras. And so we formed an initiative and coalition of organizations, including the Communication Workers of America, the United Methodist Church, United Church of Christ, as well as Filipino organizations throughout the U.S. who are frustrated by Duterte's crimes, to push for Congress U.S. Congress to really show action behind words, because again, there's U.S. Congress people who have criticized Duterte's action in crackdown on press freedom and the killings. But again, as the United States is one of the major suppliers of arms and military aid to the Philippines, we're pushing for a Philippine Human Rights Act that will suspend U.S. military aid to the country until it's clear that these crimes are not happening. So you can go to our website. There's been a lot of support from communities for this campaign, including the AFL-CIO. And then there is actually a statement came out today along with Communication Workers of America, SEIU, and the Teamsters, as well as USW, calling for also the introduction of the Philippine Human Rights Act. And so there's a lot of labor groups involved as well. And so, yeah, please visit our website, and there's options to how to get engaged in the campaign through that website.
Yeah, that's a really that's great work that you got those huge unions to sign on. In fact, I wonder how you did it. Do they see this as a union issue or a labor rights issue, or is it because of the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines? What brought them in?
Yeah, well, really, I think one of the things that may not be as known or published about the Philippines in a lot of the vacation advertising that's put out there, and then the pictures of the islands where you can go boating in the tropics. What maybe people don't know about as much is that there is a vibrant movement of workers organizing in the Philippines, and who mobilize really in the thousands, who are organized in factories and workplaces across the country. And so it's really the support of unions here in the United States is really a credit to the labor movement in the Philippines, especially an organization called Kilusang Mayo Uno, which is May 1st movement. And again, organizes throughout the country. There's even under the Duterte administration, there's been an uptick in strikes that happen, which are also coupled with increasing state violence. The union movement in the Philippines is one that is targeted by the Duterte administration. One of the issues that's come up specifically around workers' rights in the Philippines is that Duterte promised regular contractualization, or and so what that means is basically an end to temporary work and to give workers long-standing jobs, instead of a practice that's rampant in the Philippines that people will have a temporary job for like a month or so and then get laid off, as a way that it really saves the company money and results in low wages and lack of benefits. So Duterte said he was going to end that. He said, I'm going to end contractualization and make jobs regular and not temporary. That hasn't happened, which again is not surprising under the Duterte regime. But what it has brought is again, mass protests for workers in the Philippines, speaking out against the injustices of this. And at the same time, I think labor groups in the United States recognize that. And then Communication Workers of America specifically has a relationship with call center workers in the Philippines, who, when Communication Workers of America sent a delegation to the Philippines to build worker-to-worker solidarity internationally, they had an experience where the union they were working with was being targeted by the military at the time. And they were at a protest line, and the workers from the U.S. were with the workers from the Philippines, and the Philippine military came to them and were threatening them. And so I think at the same time, it's important to note that a lot of the call center jobs from the U.S. are exported to the Philippines. The Philippines is one of the highest areas of the industry.
Yeah, so the people we speak to on the other end of the phone could be facing police harassment or worse in Manila or wherever they are located. What percentage of of people living in the Philippines speaks English?
I guess that's one thing to highlight in terms of the colonial past of the Philippines,
Mhm.
is that English is a required language in school,
Mm.
and a very strong amount of Filipinos, especially in the cities, speak English,
Mm.
and it's something that's really pushed. To be honest, I don't have a percentage,
Mm.
but again, it's something that should be noted that it's a very key part of the education system in the Philippines. That even um, often students go to school, and the only time they speak Tagalog, the national language of the Philippines, is actually in like a Tagalog language class, and all the other classes
Oh,
are in English.
really?
Um,
Oh, well,
yeah,
I didn't know that. Well, how many Filipinos are in the U.S. as far as we know?
yeah. I mean, unofficially, there's at least 4 million.
Mm.
Um, yeah, but again, that doesn't account for keeping in mind Filipinos who are undocumented as well, and so much more likely that it's very much more than 4 million.
Yeah, so the connection is quite wide and deep.
Hmm.
You were speaking about labor, and I did want to get in a question about the
Hmm.
seafarers,
Hmm.
because you mentioned them, and I had heard something
Hmm.
about how so many Filipino seafarers are stuck
Hmm.
at sea, not allowed to disembark for months at a time because of COVID-19. But I'm sure
Hmm.
this is a long-standing problem about the rights of seafarers.
Yes. So I'm a part of organization. It's called the Pacific Coast Coalition for Seafarers, and that's based out here in Portland. Um, and what we found over the years, um, and again, noting that Filipinos make up the majority of seafarers in the world. Um, are some of the most exploited workers in the world on one of the most dangerous jobs in the world,
Mm.
in being out at sea. And during COVID-19 in particular, that's even worse, you can imagine. So some of the issues that we've seen is that there's regular cases of wage theft, because we have to remember that uh, these groups of seafarers are out in the middle of the ocean. And so the level of accountability and for labor rights becomes much more challenging. The other thing that happens with that is there's a rule called flags of convenience. And what that means is, um, because it's at sea again, ships can fly a flag of a different country at their convenience. That's where the phrase comes, flags of convenience,
Mm.
that would essentially give them the right to apply the labor law in another country or their level of law to the conditions on the ships. Um, and so that's like another way in which the shipping industry can actually exploit the seafarers and workers is by using low labor standards. Um, so those are a couple of things in context. The specifics and some of the most terrifying things we've seen is there's been cases in which um, captains have really cracked down on seafarers. So there was one case which was reported in which a seafarer was actually thrown off the boat as punishment, but said he was, he fell off. And there was another case in which there was a seafarer speaking up about issues, and then his punishment was he was put in the freezer on the ship. And so those are a couple examples. And then that's not even to speak of like with the Philippine government, there's also a lot of issues around one, like healthcare. So in recent years, there was a pulling back of like measures around ability to get disability after getting injured on a ship. to the extent where, again, not as much is covered. And then there's issues with pre-existing conditions, which make seafarers more vulnerable too. And there's a much larger process to prove this actually happened on a ship and so on. And even now with COVID-19, one of the main issues is repatriation. In that seafarers are currently just stuck on the boats. And so while they may have a 6-month contract, they've actually been extended to 8, 9, 10, and ongoing months. In the Philippines specifically, the Philippine government is not responding to actually repatriate and help people come back to the Philippines in a safe and healthy way. And so many seafarers are just still stuck out on the boats because, again, the government, despite the pandemic, is not taking efforts to provide infrastructure to help people go back to their country and be with their families after being on the boat so long.
That is distressing. And I hope that some of the viewers will look into this issue more. We have about 4 more minutes to go for today's show. And I did want to ask you, since you're living in Portland, and we were just talking about, pre-existing conditions, we can't all go to protests. But obviously, we all are very aware of the protests and also the disproportionate crackdown of federal troops, basically, on demonstrators in Portland. So I was wondering if you know anyone who's involved, and also, does this remind you of any of the situation in any way back in the Philippines?
Yeah, so it's not as Portland, I don't know if we're used to being in the national spotlight so much. So this is really I think a unique time. I think maybe what's not unique is that it's a level of repression, whether here in the United States or in the Philippines, because I think the connections you made are correct. In that the crackdown in here on activists specifically is very similar to what we see in the Philippines. You had mentioned at the beginning there was the enactment of the anti-terror law in the country, which, again, if anyone posts anything negative, even on social media, or criticizing the government, they could be subject to being criticized by the Philippine government and being arrested. And so I think I see the same thing in the US, where you even see President Trump saying like, oh, Antifa are terrorists. And so there's much a push to call activists terrorists, and that's a similar issue we share. I think one similarity too that we can draw is actually the federal agents in Portland are the Customs Border Patrol, which we've seen commit a lot of crimes at the border of the United States in terms of treatments of migrants. We also saw a case specifically of a Filipino, of a Muslim or Moro activist. So Jerome Abba is a leader in a Moro people's organization pushing progressive issues in Southern Philippines. And he came out to the United States in 2018. iChirp was integral in helping him come out here to actually speak at a major church gathering, Ecumenical Advocacy Days in Washington, D.C. And when he arrived, there was a pause and we couldn't get a hold of him. He was arriving at SFO, San Francisco Airport. And we didn't know why we couldn't get a hold of him. And as it came out, he was actually detained by Customs Border Patrol and interrogated. And as we talked to him later, although he ended up being sent back to the Philippines immediately, he never came to the United States officially except the airport. His report is that he was actually tortured by Customs Border Patrol, and that he's Muslim, but he was forced to. He was only given a ham sandwich, and they made him strip off his clothes. and sit in front of a big industrial fan. And then someone even put a handgun and grenade on the table he was sitting at. And again, this is from...
Yeah, that's really crazy. And the hash sandwich is just, they're just having fun. I guess they didn't have any red wine to go with it. But as far as this letter, I just wanted to say that ICHRP is asking the government of Philippines to accept the report and the recommendations of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on this really harsh anti-terror law. And I just wondered, before we finish, if you could just say very briefly what you're asking.
Yeah, again, this is a time when the crackdown on Filipinos is really harrowing for both people we know personally and a lot of people in the country. And in light of a UN human rights report bringing up these issues in the Philippines, there was a recommendation to form a monitoring committee on the human rights situation in the Philippines. And the report has been given, and we're still awaiting a vote to make that official. And so, again, we're asking for people to sign on and support that in solidarity with the Filipino people during this time.
Okay, and if people want to sign on, or they have organizations that could sign on, could they just go to your website?
Yeah, they can go to ichirp.net, or they can also send us an email at ichirpus@gmail.com.
Great. Okay, I guess that's all the time we have, but this is quite enlightening, whether it's a mistreatment of Filipinos in the Philippines or in the United States. It reminds us that unless we fight to use it, we lose it as far as human rights. Okay, here is just an image of an upcoming event about the genocide of the Roma and the Sinti. It is coming up next week, and a reminder that vulnerable groups of all kinds are targeted, and we must be serious about not only saying never again, but working to ensure that we don't have these ongoing holocausts and genocides. And we hope that this great struggle that you guys are involved with to defend human rights in Philippines will be successful, and that Americans can step up as allies. And good work about the unions, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Adam, for having me on.
Thank you.